He didn't ask for license or registration, he just saw a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car, and decided she didn't belong. What he didn't see was the courtroom pin still clipped to her collar. What he didn't know was that the woman he shoved, cuffed, and accused was a sitting judge. And what started as a routine stop was about to become a national scandal that would shake the foundation of their town and his career. Dear listeners, this isn't just another case of mistaken identity. This is a story about dignity in the face of disgrace. About a woman who rose through generations of injustice and met prejudice, not with rage but with quiet, unshakable power. We invite you to share where you're listening from. Tell us what moved you in the comments, we always read them. And if stories like this speak to your values, challenge your assumptions, or stir something in your heart, please consider subscribing and tap the bell icon so you don't miss the next voice that deserves to be heard. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin the story. It was an early April morning when the Georgia sun had just begun to rise above the horizon. Judge Miriam Ellison sat quietly by her breakfast window, both hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, her gaze resting on the backyard where azaleas bloomed in soft coral pink bursts. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtain, brushing gently across her cheek, casting a warm gold hue that softened the stern lines of her face, though the faint shadows beneath her eyes still betrayed a string of restless nights. The old wooden house just 2 miles from downtown Savannah had been her anchor for over 30 years, since the day she first took her seat on the bench. Every worn step and chipped paint told the story of a woman who had chosen to root herself in this place, not for comfort but for the cracks she believed were worth mending. In the quiet light of morning, she wasn't dressed in her familiar judicial robes or tailored courtroom suit, but in a soft gray sweater and a simple pair of khakis. Part of her hope today would pass as peacefully as the scene outside suggested. But another part, the part seasoned by decades in courtrooms, where every word had weight and every silence had consequences, knew that peace often only existed as a thin veil over things not yet stirred. When the landline rang in the living room, she rose slowly, her steps steady, and measured the same way she always walked toward the bench. "Yes, this is Judge Ellison," she answered, her voice, calm, poised, an unmistakable voice of someone used to making space for truth without needing to raise her tone. The caller was a law student from Morehouse College, organizing a community panel on judicial reform. "Justice Ellison, it would mean the world to us if you could come and speak about justice and your experience in the system. You're an example to so many of us." Miriam offered a small smile, not from vanity but from recognizing sincerity when she heard it. "I'll be there," she replied. "But I'm not coming to lecture. I'm coming to listen. And if anyone asks, I'm just a woman who once believed that law was where we start, not where we stop." By the time she left the house, the warmth of spring had started to settle into the air, laced with magnolia blossoms and the distant buzz of cicadas. She stepped out the door, locked up her graphite black Cadillac Escalade 2025, and gently adjusted the star-shaped brooch her daughter had given her on her 60th birthday. Her movements weren't fast, but they were purposeful, as if each one had its own gravity. As she drove through the shaded lanes lined with century-old oaks, sunlight cut through the canopy, scattering gold across the dashboard's polished wood trim. She tuned in to the morning broadcast on public radio, where the host spoke with a somber tone about America's growing distrust in its justice system. Miriam didn't speak. She simply exhaled long and quiet. In her mind, old memories rose uninvited. The year was 1968. She had watched her mother trembling stand before a white officer just for asking directions to a polling station. Or the time in law school when a professor dismissed her from a seminar saying her approach to legal philosophy wasn't grounded in tradition. But she didn't carry bitterness. What she carried was memory, persistence, the resolve of someone who had learned to exist within a system that was never built with her in mind. When she pulled into the hotel's parking lot, the clock read 8:43 a.m. She turned off the engine and stayed seated for a moment, looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were not young, but they were sharp and still capable of holding steady when the truth demanded it. She reached into the back seat for a modest leather tote which held her printed remarks and a worn copy of Simple Justice, a gift for one of the students. As her hand wrapped around the door handle, she paused, not out of hesitation but because she could feel something shifting in the air, an invisible current that whispered of tension, unspoken of histories beneath concrete. She stepped out of the car, the breeze catching the hem of her sweater, carrying the breath of morning and echoes of struggle. And in that moment, she wasn't a justice or a keynote speaker or a name in any legal directory. She was simply a 64-year-old black woman standing in the golden light of daybreak, walking into what was supposed to be an ordinary event, unaware that in just a few short hours, her dignity, her title, and her silence would be put on trial in the very city she had spent a lifetime trying to serve. But in that moment, she didn't know. And that's what made her expression as she stepped into the hotel lobby composed, trusting, serene an image no one who saw it would ever forget. Savannah in the spring always carried a certain kind of weight, beautiful on the surface, but humming beneath with a slow, unspoken tension that never truly faded. Judge Miriam Ellison knew this rhythm by heart, the way moss clung to the ancient oaks lining Victory Drive, the way the red brick of old townhouses seemed to absorb both the sunlight and the sins of history. As she drove past familiar intersections, her eyes caught glimpses of fading murals, painted in honor of civil rights leaders, some cracked by time, others touched up by young hands, who hadn't lived the struggle but carried it still. The city was a paradox, steeped in tradition, shaped by conflict, dressed in charm but haunted by memory. It whispered its past through the creak of shutters, the hum of cicadas, the subtle shift in a shopkeeper's smile, when someone crossed the street with too much confidence. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, but her shoulders were tight, pulled ever so slightly inward, as if guarding something unseen. There was a heaviness in the air that morning, barely noticeable, like humidity before a storm, but it found its way into her bones just the same. She passed Forsyth Park, where families gathered under umbrellas, and old men played chess on stone tables worn smooth by decades of palms and patience. A jogger crossed in front of her, earbuds in oblivious. And on the corner, a pair of young boys balanced their bikes beside a gas station wall, laughing hard about something small, something only 12-year-olds could find truly hilarious. She smiled at the sight, but the moment passed quickly. Her attention snapped back to the road. At a red light near Abercorn and Liberty, she watched a police cruiser roll slowly past her lane, windows up, lights off, just patrolling. The officer didn't glance her way, or if he did, he made no sign of it. And yet her breath caught for half a second, her body instinctively still, her mind too quick to calculate what could be misread. She was used to this quiet scanning of her own presence in public, this subtle choreography of awareness, not out of guilt, but survival. It had been decades since she'd been followed in a department store, since she'd had her ID double-checked for authenticity, but the memory still lived under her skin, ready to rise. As the cruiser turned the corner and disappeared behind a row of sycamores, she let out that breath, slow and silent, barely more than a whisper through her nose. "You'd think by now I'd stop doing that," she murmured, half to herself, half to the silence around her. She adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of her own eyes, steady, intelligent, but undeniably tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes from carrying too much history, too much responsibility, and being told to be grateful for both. By the time she reached the hotel conference center on Oglethorpe Avenue, the morning had grown warmer, the city alive with movement and texture. The valet waved her into a reserved parking spot with practiced politeness, his face young, his uniform crisp. As she stepped out of the car, he gave a small nod and said, "Good morning, ma'am." She returned the greeting with a smile that carried quiet authority, then walked past the line of palm planters and into the glass-paneled lobby, heels clicking softly on the polished floor. The air inside was cool, the kind of artificial calm that convention centers pride themselves on. But outside those walls, the world didn't pause. And Miriam Ellison never forgot that. Inside the main ballroom, a dozen volunteers bustled about, adjusting microphones, checking slide decks, arranging rows of chairs. A young black woman with thick glasses and a clipboard rushed toward her. "Justice Ellison, I'm so sorry we didn't know you were here already." Miriam raised a hand, gentle but firm. "No apologies necessary," she said, her voice low, composed. "I'm early by choice. I like to see how things are built before they're presented." The woman nodded quickly, then guided her toward the green room. Along the way, a few students turned their heads, whispering names, pointing subtly, reverently, like they were in the presence of someone they'd only read about in class. Once alone in the prep room, she sat in silence, letting her body settle into the weight of the day. The hum of the overhead lights blended with the faint vibration of voices from the hall. She folded her hands in her lap, fingertips resting lightly against the back of the opposite palm. There was no fear in her, only the slight ache of anticipation of knowing that words mattered more than ever, especially when spoken by someone who'd already paid the price of being heard. A knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Your Honor, someone said gently. She stood, adjusted her brooch, smoothed her blazer. In the hallway, as she approached the ballroom, the low murmur of the crowd grew louder, rising into something just shy of a hush, one that only comes when people feel a moment forming before it happens. She paused just before the entrance, letting her hand rest briefly on the edge of the doorframe. For a single heartbeat, she thought of her father's worn Sunday shoes, pacing outside the church in Macon, waiting to shake hands with Martin Luther King Sr., of her mother whispering poems from Langston Hughes while ironing uniforms late into the night, and of the teenage girl she once was, brilliant, afraid, unseen, walking into her first college seminar with a spine made of silence and steel. She drew breath, straightened her back, and stepped forward into the light. And just like that, in the middle of a beautiful southern city wrapped in Spanish moss and southern charm, Miriam Ellison became not just a judge or a speaker, but the still point in a room full of motion, the quiet center around which everything else began to turn. The conference had just wrapped its opening panel when Judge Miriam Ellison stepped out into the warm light of the hotel courtyard, the late morning sun casting soft reflections across the windows of her black Cadillac Escalade parked near the front. The vehicle, polished to a deep shine, bore discreet custom plates that read simply, Veritas Latin for Truth, a silent tribute to the principle that had guided her life for more than 4 decades. Her heels clicked lightly against the stone walkway as she approached her steps, even her posture erect, a presence both dignified and understated. She carried a small white gift bag in one hand, a signed copy of Simple Justice, for a graduating student whose parents had introduced themselves after her speech. As she neared the SUV, she reached into her blazer pocket, retrieving the key fob with one fluid motion, her fingers steady and sure. Just behind her, laughter from a group of students echoed across the courtyard, their energy vibrant, unfiltered, full of admiration and hope. One called out, "Thank you again, Justice Ellison," and she turned slightly, offering a smile and a gentle nod, the kind of gesture that lingers longer than applause. She didn't raise her voice, didn't wave, but somehow still left them with something, an imprint of grace wrapped in quiet strength. The hum of birdsong mixed with the distant murmur of downtown traffic, and somewhere nearby a saxophone played faintly, the notes spilling out from an open cafe window across the street. She loved that about Savannah, the way music lived in the seams of the city, in doorways and under trees, uninvited but never unwelcome. Reaching for the rear passenger door, she slid the gift bag onto the leather seat, then paused for a moment, her fingers resting on the edge of the frame as she looked up toward the flowering branches overhead. And then she heard the voice, sharp, flat, authoritative. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." It came from behind her, a few paces off, clipped and calculated, the kind of tone that didn't invite questions. Miriam turned slowly, her face composed, her eyes clear, taking in the figure of a uniformed officer approaching with deliberate steps. He was young, mid-30s, perhaps with close-cropped brown hair, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, one hand hovering just inches from his belt where his service weapon rested in plain sight. His stance was tense but not aggressive yet, but something in the tightness of his jaw told her he had already made up his mind about who she was. She gave him a slight incline of her head and said calmly, "Is there a problem, officer?" The man didn't answer right away. He walked a slow circle around the front of the vehicle, eyes scanning the windshield, the license plate, then her shoes, her suit, the subtle gold pin fastened just above her lapel. "We received a report about a suspicious vehicle matching this description," he said finally, voice low but firm. "High-end SUV, possibly stolen. I need to see ID and proof of ownership." She blinked once, the expression on her face, not quite disbelief. She was long past that, but something closer to recognition. "This is my car," she said, even still professional. "I can show you my ID, registration, and badge." That last word seemed to shift something in him. His eyes narrowed. "Badge," he repeated, voice tilted sideways like the syllable offended him. "What kind of badge?" She reached slowly into her blazer pocket again, careful not to startle, and pulled out the engraved leather case bearing her state seal. She held it up gently, clearly. "Miriam Ellison, Georgia State Supreme Court. I'm a sitting judge." The silence that followed was brief but suffocating. The officer stared at the badge, then back at her, but made no move to step back or apologize. Instead, he took a step closer. "I'll still need you to move away from the vehicle, ma'am," he said, the edge in his tone sharper now. "You can't prove ownership just by saying you're a judge." Her breath caught not from fear but from something colder, familiarity. This wasn't the first time someone had chosen not to believe her, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. "You can run the plates," she said quietly. "They're registered in my name. The title's in the glove compartment, and again, this is my car." He didn't budge. Instead, his hand moved to his belt, unclipping the handcuffs from their holster, with a practiced click that echoed far louder than it should have in the open air. "I'm going to need you to place your hands where I can see them," he said, stepping forward. "Now." For a brief second, she considered resisting, not physically but verbally, rationally. She could argue. She could explain. She could assert her rights, her title, her innocence. But something inside her said no. Not now. Not here. Not in front of those students. Not in the courtyard of a hotel, named after justice. Not with the wrong officer on the wrong day, and the wrong assumptions pulling tight around the edges of his certainty. So she did what so many before her had been forced to do. She complied. She raised her hands slowly, fingers open, movement deliberate. She said nothing more. He stepped behind her, cuffed her wrists too tight without care, and turned her toward the patrol car, now idling by the curb. From the edge of her vision, she saw the students stop laughing. One held up a phone. Another whispered something that sounded like, "Is this real?" She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to stop. But as the cold steel bit into her wrists and the gift bag sat forgotten on the back seat, she did something else. She closed her eyes, not in shame, not in defeat, but in knowing, because in that moment, handcuffed beside the very car she had bought with her own savings, wearing the suit she'd worn to swear in appellate judges in the city, where she had ruled over hundreds of trials, she knew something with absolute clarity. They didn't see a judge. They didn't see a citizen. They didn't see her at all. They saw what they were trained to see. And she knew deep in the quiet center of herself that this was not the end of the story, just the moment where it would have to begin again. But she kept that knowledge to herself, and instead she stood still as marble, as still as history, and let them walk her away. The concrete of the sidewalk pressed firm beneath her feet as Judge Miriam Ellison stood still, hands restrained behind her back, the chill of the steel cuffs biting through the thin fabric of her blazer sleeves. Around her, the world did not pause. As it should have, cars moved past without slowing the hotel. Doormen shifted uneasily in the background, and a trio of conference attendees murmured in disbelief from the glass doors they had just exited. The officer's grip on her upper arm was tight, not rough but impersonal, as though he were guiding an object rather than a person, a routine motion to him perhaps, but something entirely different for the woman in his custody. She said nothing, as he led her toward the patrol car, her head held high, chin lifted, not in defiance, but in quiet resolve, her breath, even her stride controlled, despite the humiliation now clinging to her like a second skin. The officer hadn't asked questions, hadn't waited for explanations, hadn't even glanced twice at the credentials she had offered him. He had seen a black woman standing beside a luxury vehicle in a space marked reserved, and from that image alone he had built his entire case. "We're just doing our job," he muttered under his breath, as he opened the cruiser door, though the words rang hollow like a line rehearsed too many times to still mean anything. Miriam didn't respond. She had no intention of giving him the performance he expected, no need to plead or shout or assert her authority now that he had already decided she didn't possess any. The moment her body folded into the back seat of the cruiser, the space seemed to shrink around her, the air inside stale and warm, laced faintly with the scent of rubber dust and something metallic. She shifted slightly to find balance with her wrists, bound her knees angled to the side to avoid the barrier in front of her, and fixed her gaze on the glass window, now smudged with fingerprints and specks of dried pollen. Through the narrow slot, she could still see her car untouched, unlocked, waiting as if unaware that the person who had driven it only minutes earlier was now branded a suspect. Her heart wasn't racing. It had learned long ago not to waste energy on panic. What settled in her chest instead was something colder, like wet stone, heavy and ancient, the familiar weight of injustice descending in silence. This wasn't the first time the world had treated her body as a threat. Rather than a presence, wasn't the first time her title had disappeared the moment someone chose not to see it. But it was the first time she had felt the metal close around her skin, had heard the radio crackle with her name spoken as a possible suspect, had sensed the ripple of silence from a crowd that should have known better. She watched the officer as he walked around to the driver's side, speaking briefly into the radio. His tone was casual, efficient, utterly detached from the reality he had just imposed on someone else's life. Female, black, mid-60s Navy suit, driving a black Cadillac Escalade plates, check clean, but subject claims to be a judge. The words rolled from his mouth like items from a grocery list, void of curiosity, void of care. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaled once, slow and deep, then opened them again. A soft buzz from her phone echoed from her purse, still sitting on the sidewalk untouched where it had fallen when she was cuffed. Her contacts, her court calendar, her emergency legal line, all out of reach. The irony made her lips tighten slightly. For years, she had presided over cases where officers insisted they were trained to assess threats based on behavior, not appearance. And yet here she was guilty of walking with purpose and unlocking her own vehicle in a tailored suit. A small crowd had gathered now at the edge of the courtyard. Some had their phones raised, recording from a distance not too close, not enough to intervene, just enough to say later that they saw something. A few whispered among themselves, glancing nervously toward the patrol car, as though uncertain whether they should feel concern or confirmation. One woman, mid-30s, with a conference badge still swinging from her neck, stepped forward slightly, then seemed to think better of it and retreated into the hotel. Miriam watched it all with a kind of detached clarity, as if she were both inside the scene and observing it from above, as if part of her had already begun filing away details, collecting context, building the case in her mind that no one had bothered to build for her. She didn't blame the people watching, not entirely. The bystander effect was older than any of them, rooted in fear, in uncertainty, in the desperate human hope that staying silent might spare you from being next. It wasn't until the officer finally entered the vehicle, settled into the seat, and turned on the ignition that she spoke again. "You still haven't told me where we're going," she said, her voice calm, steady, the same tone she had used 1,000 times in courtrooms across the state. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but didn't meet her eyes. "Precinct for questioning," he said flatly. "We'll get it sorted." She let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, just enough to move the air. "You didn't ask me anything," she said. "You made an assumption. That's not sorting, that's skipping the process you swore to uphold." His knuckles tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but he said nothing more. The car pulled out from the curb, turning left onto the main street, passing familiar storefronts that now blurred past the windows. The city outside moved on, untouched by what was happening inside this vehicle. No sirens, no urgency, just the hum of the engine, the hum of quiet damage. As they crossed the intersection, she caught her reflection in the side mirror, her hair still pinned neatly, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady and unswerving. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look angry. What she looked like, what she felt like, was tired. Not from the cuffs or the drive or the insult, but from the knowledge that no matter how many titles you earn, how many laws you uphold, or how many verdicts you write, there are still days when a black woman in America is just a question mark in someone else's mind. And in that moment, as the cruiser rolled past the courthouse where she had once stood to deliver decisions that shaped lives and futures, she closed her eyes again, not to escape, but to anchor herself, to remember who she was and who this man had failed to see. The cuffs remained. The damage was done. But the truth was still hers, and that truth would follow them both long after the engine went quiet. They didn't take her all the way into the station. Instead, the patrol car pulled into a side lot adjacent to the municipal intake center, a place Judge Miriam Ellison had driven past 1,000 times, never imagining she'd be seated behind its tinted cruiser windows, staring at the faded concrete where she herself had once signed off on funding requests and public safety budgets. The officer she'd overheard someone call him Banning opened the rear door with a short, flat command, "Out." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to. Miriam slid out slowly, her spine stiff, her hands still cuffed behind her back, and her heels landing softly on the pavement with a deliberate grace that even handcuffs couldn't break. There were other officers nearby, standing in loose conversation near the entrance. One looked up, squinting at her from under the brim of his cap. His brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to place her face, but no words followed. Banning led her inside with a firm touch at her elbow, not aggressive, but unmistakably controlling the way one might guide a reluctant package rather than a person. The intake hallway was lined with gray tile and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. The air smelled of old coffee, rubber soles, and institutional dust, familiar scents, but they carried a different weight from the wrong side of the threshold. They didn't book her. They didn't fingerprint her. Banning handed off her ID and registration to a desk sergeant, mumbled something about stolen vehicle suspicion, then stepped away to speak in low tones with another officer. Miriam stood near the far wall, still cuffed, still silent, her breath slow and shallow, her back pressed against cool tile. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't shift her weight. She waited. The only sound was the soft click of a clock on the wall and the occasional creak of leather from someone adjusting their belt. After several minutes, a heavy-set man with graying temples and a skeptical expression walked over holding her badge and ID in his left hand. "Your Honor," he said, not with warmth but with weary recognition. "Why didn't you just say who you were when they stopped you?" Miriam tilted her head slightly. "I did," she replied, her tone calm and clipped. He didn't care. The man frowned and turned back toward the desk, muttering something she couldn't hear. A few more minutes passed before the cuffs were finally removed. Her wrists throbbed slightly as the metal released red marks blooming faintly on her skin like slow bruises. She didn't rub them. She simply flexed her fingers, turning them outward once, as if remembering they belonged to her. No one offered an apology. No one even met her eyes directly. A young officer handed her back her belongings in a plastic tray, avoiding contact as if she might break or speak or challenge what they all knew had just happened. Outside, the late morning light had shifted. The air was warmer now, the clouds drifting in with soft edges, casting shadows over the parking lot. She walked out alone, her bag in one hand, her steps quiet and purposeful. Her SUV was still there, untouched, a silent witness to her humiliation. She stood beside it for a moment, not unlocking it, not moving, just breathing long, deep breaths like anchors against the rising tide inside her chest. There were no reporters, no shouting, no protests. Just a few passing cars, a bird calling from a wire overhead, and the slow realization that what had just happened would never appear in any official report unless she put it there herself. She opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it behind her. Inside, it was quiet, the cabin still cool from earlier, her phone vibrating repeatedly from missed calls and notifications. Someone had filmed it. She didn't need to check to know that. The eyes she'd felt watching had likely been recording too. She stared at the screen as names flashed across colleagues, clerks, activists, journalists, all asking what had happened, where she was, and whether she needed help. But for now, she didn't respond. She sat motionless, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her posture perfect as always, but her body no longer still from discipline. It was still because she needed the silence. Not for reflection, not even for composure, but to preserve something untouched inside her, something not yet warped by what had just occurred. The sound of her own breath filled the cabin, low and steady, the kind of breath one takes not to calm down but to prepare to gather. She started the engine not with a jolt, but with the ease of someone returning to motion, not out of choice but necessity. The GPS chirped softly from the console, asking if she wanted directions. She turned it off. She didn't need directions. She knew exactly where she was going, and more importantly, what would come next. As the car rolled forward, she adjusted the mirror, catching her own reflection once again. Her lipstick had faded, her earrings were slightly misaligned, and there was a strand of gray hair loose near her temple. She smoothed it gently, then looked herself in the eye. There was no rage, no tears. Just a quiet, crystalline clarity that only came in the moments after something sacred had been violated. Her dignity had not been broken. Her pride had not been shattered. But her patience, her enduring, well-honed patience, had just met its limit. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she answered. "Charisse," she said, her voice composed but unmistakably altered, as if something fundamental in her cadence had shifted without force. "I need a few files. Old ones. Complaints against field officers' use of force reviews, anything that passed through internal affairs and never saw daylight." There was a pause on the other end, then her friend's voice came through, tight and concerned. What happened? Miriam turned the wheel onto a quieter street passing storefronts she no longer really saw. "He put cuffs on me," she said simply. "Didn't ask. Didn't listen. Didn't care." Another pause. "Then are you okay?" Miriam thought about the question, let it settle inside her. No, she said, but I will be, and he won't be. As she drove the city around, her blurred, charming sidewalks, blooming trees, old brick buildings whispering history. But she didn't see it the way she had that morning. Not anymore. Something had cracked not just in the world but in the architecture of her own restraint. And as the tires hummed against the road and the sky above her began to darken with the threat of late spring rain, she knew exactly what had just been set in motion. She would not file a complaint. She would start a reckoning. And this time it would have her name on every page. When Miriam returned home that evening, the golden hush of twilight had already begun to fold itself gently over her quiet neighborhood, casting long, solemn shadows across the brick walkway. She had paced so many mornings with coffee in one hand and clarity in the other. The metal imprint of the handcuffs still marked the tender skin of her wrists, a shallow memory of pressure that hadn't broken the surface but had gone deep enough to linger. As she turned the key and stepped inside the familiar creak of the wood, beneath her feet felt suddenly strange, as if the house itself recognized something in her had changed. The silence greeted her not with comfort, but with weight, thick, unmoving, holding space for 1,000 questions she was not yet ready to ask aloud. She set her bag down on the bench near the hallway, her movements slow, precise, more from intention than fatigue. A faint breeze from the slightly ajar kitchen window stirred the edge of a curtain, letting in the sounds of a world still moving, distant voices from a neighbor's porch, the rhythmic chirp of cicadas warming into the night, and a soft clinking of glass as someone 2 doors down poured a drink. Miriam stood there for a long moment, unmoving, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, as if grounding herself through touch. She did not cry. She did not curse. She did not collapse into some cinematic unraveling of control. Instead, she walked into the bathroom, peeled off the blazer she had worn all day, and folded it with care, placing it over the back of a chair as if it were still worthy of the dignity it had carried this morning. She looked in the mirror and saw a version of herself that was both entirely known and eerily unfamiliar. Cheekbones, firm mouth, set eyes clear but distant. There was no blood, no bruise, no visible wound to explain why she felt like something had been removed from her without permission. Only the faint red ovals circling her wrists, and the echo of his voice still lingering in her ears like static. You can't prove ownership just by saying you're a judge. That was the sentence that stayed with her. Not the accusation, not the cuffs, but that one line uttered with such conviction it bordered on practiced because it revealed something deeper than suspicion. It revealed disregard. It wasn't disbelief in her title. It was disbelief in her right to carry it. She moved into her home office, flicked on the soft amber desk lamp, and opened the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, the one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were folders thick with documents, notes from cases that never made headlines, letters from public defenders who'd gone unheard, handwritten affidavits folded into envelopes, too personal to scan, too painful to ignore. Her fingers brushed over them like you might touch an old wound, not to test if it hurts, but to remind yourself it happened. She took one file out, then another and another. They spread across her desk in uneven stacks, like a quiet, unmoving tide, a private archive of the very system that had just wrapped steel around her bones. She pulled her chair forward, sat down with the same composure she used in the courtroom, and began to read. Not to remember, but to see. Really see. To piece together a story that had always been there but that she had until now compartmentalized for the sake of functionality, for the illusion that a system might be flawed but salvageable. 2 hours passed without her noticing. When the phone rang, she didn't flinch. She checked the screen. Charisse. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me everything her friend said, no preamble, no softening. Miriam leaned back in her chair, one hand pressing gently to her forehead, fingers splayed, as if holding her thoughts in place. He cuffed me, she said plainly. In the parking lot. No warning. Said the car looked too expensive. There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches not from disbelief but from rage, trying to stay calm. Did he know who you were? He didn't care. Another pause. Then what are you going to do? Miriam exhaled through her nose, slow and quiet. I'm not sure yet, she answered. But I'm not going to forget. Later that night, long after the phone call ended and the house had returned to stillness, she stepped outside onto the porch, a blanket draped around her shoulders, the air cool and damp from a passing rain. She watched the darkened sky above, not for answers but for alignment, for some signal that what she carried inside her wasn't hers alone to hold. The trees moved gently like slow breathing. A cat crossed the street with indifferent grace. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes rattled softly, their delicate tones brushing against the night like half-spoken names. She looked down at her hands again now, bare the marks faint but not yet gone. She flexed her fingers slowly, and a strange calm settled in her chest. Not the kind that follows peace, but the kind that comes just before decision. Then she turned, walked back inside, and locked the door behind her with care. She didn't need to plan yet. She just needed to remember exactly how it felt to stand completely still while someone else decided she didn't belong. By Monday morning, the storm that began in silence had started to move above the surface, slow but deliberate, like thunder rolling low across flat land, long before any lightning is seen. Judge Miriam Ellison stepped into her courthouse chambers just before 7:00 a.m. An hour earlier than usual, her posture composed, her briefcase tucked beneath one arm and a paper cup of tea balanced quietly in the other hand. The building was still half asleep, the halls empty except for the occasional echo of a janitor's cart rolling over tile and the rhythmic hum of air ducts waking up for the day. Her heels made soft, steady taps against the floor, familiar sounds in a familiar place, but they felt different now, as if the ground beneath her knew it had become something more than neutral space. She didn't speak to anyone on her way in, not because she was avoiding conversation, but because she needed the solitude. Her thoughts moved in long, quiet currents, not crashing, but heavy, slow, carrying the weight of something she could no longer ignore. When she reached her office, she closed the door with care, not letting it slam, not letting it signal anything to anyone on the other side. The room welcomed her with its usual stillness, leather chairs positioned just so, bookshelves lined with precedent and history, and the small framed photograph of her late mother placed precisely next to a stone carving that read "Justice begins with truth." She sat at her desk and stared at the computer screen for several minutes, unmoving. She didn't open her email. She didn't check the docket. Instead, she opened a locked drawer and pulled out a folder marked only with a thin piece of masking tape across the top. The word "unresolved" written in her own cursive from a time when she still believed she'd find the right hour to deal with it. Inside were names, dates, complaints, and letters that had been quietly shared with her over the years, some official, some whispered, all of them carrying stories that refused to sit comfortably in the system that had promised fairness. She placed the folder flat on the desk, opened a yellow legal pad, and began to write not legal notes, not arguments, but questions. Why was this never investigated? Who signed off on the dismissal? What patterns do I already know but haven't acknowledged out loud? Her handwriting was steady, but her shoulders tensed with each line like a tide pulling tighter around a ship that hadn't yet turned its sails. A knock came at the door, soft but deliberate. Her clerk Dana peeked in with a hesitant smile. "Morning, Judge. Everything all right?" Miriam looked up, expression neutral but kind. "Yes, thank you, Dana. Just getting an early start." The younger woman nodded, sensing enough to not ask further, and closed the door behind her. Miriam exhaled, turned back to her notes, and for the next hour pieced together a timeline of forgotten names and overlooked consequences. Cases she'd presided over, officers she'd heard in testimony reports she'd once skimmed, but now read as warnings hidden in plain sight. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzz had returned. Phones rang. Footsteps echoed with more purpose. Voices drifted down the hallway discussing motions, verdicts, and coffee preferences. Miriam remained behind her door, reading silently, occasionally picking up the phone to place a discreet call, not dramatic, not accusatory, just questions posed to colleagues she trusted with discretion and clarity. "Do you still have access to the internal reviews from 17? Can you check the IA logs for Officer Banning's previous partners? Is there any chance those files are still archived in the old case server?" No one asked why she was asking, but they knew, and that silence, shared heavy but respectful, spoke more clearly than any official inquiry could. At lunch, she didn't eat. She walked quietly to the staff library, 2 floors down, and requested access to sealed archives, citing review for consistency in sentencing, a vague but unimpeachable reason. The security guard let her in without hesitation. Inside, she sat alone at the long table beneath flickering ceiling lights and flipped through digital records that hadn't been opened in years. Names began to repeat. Incidents that once looked isolated now began to resemble habits. Failure to de-escalate. Unverified field report. Discrepancy between body cam footage and written statement. It wasn't a pattern yet, not legally, but it was a shape, a shadow, a thread. That evening, long after court had adjourned and the last bailiff had gone home, she remained in her chambers with only the soft whir of the courthouse HVAC and the ticking of her desk clock for company. The sun had set the windows now, reflecting only the lamp behind her and the outlines of her own face, weary but still upright. She looked across the desk at the stack of folders. She had pulled some hers, some borrowed, some found again through persistence, and thought about what it meant to know too much. To be one of the few who couldn't say, "I didn't see it." Her phone buzzed with a message from Charisse. Any news? She didn't reply right away. She looked at the screen at the growing thread of messages that stretched back 2 nights, each one a pulse, a tether, a quiet reminder that someone was bearing witness with her. Finally, she typed, "Yes, I'm moving forward. No press, no noise. But this doesn't stay buried." She hit send, then leaned back, her hands folded her chest, rising with a breath she hadn't fully taken since the cuffs were locked around her wrists. She was no longer waiting for someone else to bring accountability. She had decided calmly, irrevocably, that it would begin with her. Outside, the courthouse lawn lay still bathed in the soft amber wash of the building's exterior lights. A flag flapped gently in the breeze, high above the steps she had walked up for nearly 20 years, always with purpose, always with belief. And now, as she stood and turned off the lamp, slipping her files into a plain leather case, she felt something settle, not peace, but readiness. She knew there would be resistance. She knew not everyone would agree, that some would accuse her of vendetta, of overreach, of political ambition masked as justice. But she also knew the cost of doing nothing. She reached for her coat, smoothed the collar, and glanced once more at the picture of her mother. "Time to work," she said softly, and walked out into the night. Under the late morning sun, with its warm light settling gently over the courthouse steps, Judge Miriam Ellison stood at the edge of a small press circle, her posture calm, her voice steady, and her words chosen with a precision honed from decades spent navigating truth in rooms far less forgiving than this open air. There were no dramatic pauses, no raised voice, no hint of performance, only the quiet force of someone who had seen enough, endured enough, and finally decided to name what should never have happened. Her statement was brief, measured, and unshakable. What occurred last Thursday morning was not a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that's been ignored for far too long. Reporters scribbled. Cameras clicked. A few murmured among themselves, surprised by her directness, her refusal to soften the truth with the usual institutional language. But Miriam wasn't interested in optics. She wasn't here to manage reputations or smooth discomfort. She was here to speak plainly, not as a judge defending her position, but as a citizen demanding better from the very system she had helped uphold. When the questions came rapid, overlapping, edged with curiosity and cynicism alike, she didn't flinch. She answered only a few, each with clarity and restraint. "Yes, I will be filing a formal complaint. No, this is not the first time I've heard similar stories. The badge should not decide who receives dignity." Then, without further explanation, she stepped down from the stone platform, walked through the crowd, and disappeared behind the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, leaving a silence in her wake that felt larger than the space she'd left behind. Inside, the air felt cooler, denser, the kind that clings to old buildings steeped in memory and ritual. As she passed through the atrium, several staff members nodded silently, their eyes carrying a mixture of worry, admiration, and something harder to name, perhaps gratitude, perhaps guilt. She nodded in return, but did not pause. There was still too much to do, and time, as always, moved faster once the headlines began. Back in her chambers, Miriam set down her briefcase and removed her coat, folding it neatly over the back of her chair. The room was quiet except for the ticking of her desk clock and the faint rustle of papers shifting in the heating draft. She leaned forward and opened her email, where the inbox was already crowded with messages, some offering support, some demanding answers, some laced with the kind of carefully coded language that pretends at neutrality but drips with unease. She scanned each with a practiced eye, mentally sorting the genuine from the performative, the concerned from the calculating. Then she saw it, an email from a retired judge she hadn't spoken to in years. Subject line, "It's time." She opened it slowly, unsure what she expected, and read the short message. "I watched the clip. I remember when you were appointed. We all knew they'd come for your authority eventually. Let me know how I can help." There was no greeting, no sign-off. Just truth clean and bare, sitting there like a bridge between generations of black jurists who had learned again and again that respect could be revoked without notice. She sat back, letting the words settle, not with sadness but with a strange sense of convergence, as if everything she had ever questioned, every hesitation she had tucked away for the sake of harmony, had finally come to the surface. And this time she would not look away. That afternoon, she drafted a letter addressed not just to the department's Internal Affairs Division, but to the City Council's Oversight Committee, the local NAACP, legal advisor, and the Public Accountability Coalition. In it, she laid out the facts with surgical clarity: times, actions, language used, the absence of protocol, the refusal to verify her identity. But more than that, she described what it felt like. She wrote about standing in the parking lot, hands behind her back, with strangers, watching and judging and not moving, not helping, not believing. She wrote about silence, how loud it can be, how painful, how permanent. She didn't use the word racism lightly, but she didn't avoid it either. She wrote it with intent, not as accusation but as diagnosis. Then she signed her name, not just as a judge, but as a woman who had given her entire career to the belief that systems could be better if people within them dared to be honest. Once the letter was printed, signed, and scanned, she walked it herself to the clerk's office, handed it directly to the chief administrator, and watched as it was logged into the public record. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet entry into the archive of a city that had until now preferred its wounds be neatly bandaged rather than exposed. By the time she returned to her office, the light had shifted again, longer shadows stretched across the carpet, and the courthouse had begun to empty for the day. She stood by the window for a while, looking down at the plaza, where a few lingering journalists still waited near the base of the steps, unsure if another statement would come. She didn't plan to give one. Not today. Instead, she sat at her desk once more, and opened a small notebook from the top drawer, the one she had used years ago, to write her first courtroom observations back when she was still clerking in Boston, long before anyone called her Your Honor. She flipped to the first blank page, uncapped a pen, and wrote one line in the center: "The difference between silence and dignity is what we choose to do next." Then she closed the book and turned off the desk lamp. Outside, the sky had turned the soft color of peach stone, and the air had grown still, as if the city itself were holding its breath. And Miriam, sitting alone in the quiet glow of her office, felt neither triumphant nor defeated, only clear, steady, and more herself than she had felt in years. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp, but by 6:15 the folding chairs were already full, and by 6:30 people were standing in clusters along the back walls, their voices low, their eyes alert, and their presence anything but casual. The room, usually reserved for budget discussions and zoning proposals, now hummed with something thicker, heavier, an unspoken current of collective anticipation. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, as if straining under the weight of so many unblinking eyes. Someone brought in a second water dispenser. The hum of whispers mixed with the soft clatter of pens tapping against notebooks, each tap echoing like a distant drumbeat of what was about to come. Judge Miriam Ellison sat in the front row, not behind the dais, not elevated above the others, but grounded among them shoulder to shoulder with teachers, small business owners, retired nurses, and church elders who had watched her grow from a quiet high school valedictorian to a woman who now symbolized something far larger than her title. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, fingers interlocked, her breath steady and deliberate. She wasn't here to speak tonight. She had already said enough. Tonight, she was here to listen. The meeting began with formalities. The Pledge of Allegiance recited a little slower than usual, followed by the roll call of council members, each name answered with a simple present that somehow felt loaded with meaning. Then the floor opened for public comment, and for a few moments no one moved, not out of fear but out of reverence. And then a woman stood. She was maybe 70, wrapped in a deep burgundy shawl, with hands that trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her voice, when it came, was clear as a bell. "My name is Gloria Patterson," she said, scanning the room with eyes that had likely seen 1,000 such gatherings, and still knew this one mattered more. "I was here in '65 when they marched through this same street, and I never thought I'd be here again for the same damn reason." The room held its breath. We believed the robe meant something. That if you got far enough, if you earned it honestly, you were safe. She turned to look at Miriam, who met her gaze without blinking. "But this what happened to you, it's not just about one officer. It's about all the doors we thought we'd walked through for good, only to find they still got locks on the other side." Applause followed, but not the kind that breaks tension. It was slow, thoughtful, as if each clap were another stone laid down in a growing path. Next, a young teacher rose to speak, her words tight with anger. "I teach my students to respect the system," she said, "to believe in civics, to know their rights. And now I have to explain how a sitting judge, a black woman, can be mistaken for a thief while going about her day." She paused, her voice cracking but unashamed. "We tell them the law protects them, but who protects them from the law?" Throughout the room, heads nodded, hands folded over chests. Some wept quietly. Others stared straight ahead, still as stone. Miriam listened to every word, her face unreadable, but her heart registering every syllable like a gavel striking wood. It wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been. She understood now that her experience had simply opened a door through which so many others were finally willing to walk, some with pain, some with questions, and all with purpose. A pastor from the East Side stood up, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm not here to indict every officer. That's not what justice is," he began. "But we must be honest enough to say when harm has been done, and brave enough to say we won't let it happen again in silence." He gestured to the crowd. "This is accountability. Right here. This room. This night." Then came a boy, no older than 15 slight, wearing a school sweatshirt too large for him, and sneakers that had seen better days. He walked slowly to the mic, glancing back only once at his mother seated behind him, then spoke with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. "My name's Elijah. Last year a cop followed me home 'cause he didn't think I lived in our neighborhood. I didn't tell anybody, until now." He looked down, then back up, eyes locking onto Miriam. "When I saw what they did to you, I figured if they can do that to a judge, then I'm not crazy for feeling scared." Miriam felt something shift in her chest, not pain, not pride, but recognition, the kind that wraps itself around a moment and tethers it to something unshakable. She offered him the smallest nod, one that said, "I hear you, and I won't forget this either." The meeting went on for nearly 3 hours. And not once did the energy wane. Not once did the room shrink. It only grew deeper, wider, more resolute. By the end of the night, action steps had been proposed. A civilian review board with actual authority, a public transparency portal for all police incidents, community listening sessions, mandated by the city charter, and most notably a request for the police chief to attend the next meeting and speak directly to the events surrounding Miriam's detainment. As the crowd filed out into the cool evening air, there was no cheering, no chants, no dramatic exits, just the quiet sound of unity of people walking together down courthouse steps that now felt a little less distant. Someone offered Miriam a thermos of tea, which she accepted with a soft thank you. She stood there for a moment watching the crowd disperse, their footsteps fading into the hum of streetlights and cicadas, beginning their nightly song. And as she turned to walk to her car, coat tucked over her arm, the courthouse glowing faintly behind her like a monument both to what had failed and what still could be redeemed, she let herself feel it, not hope exactly, but direction. Not resolution, but movement. Something had broken open, and for the first time in a long while, something else had begun to fill the space. She didn't need to say anything more. Tonight the voices belonged to the people, and they had spoken with clarity. The news didn't break quietly, it roared. By the next morning, headlines were running across local television stations, and by mid-afternoon, national outlets were picking up the story. The footage of Judge Miriam Ellison being handcuffed beside her own car was already circulating, clipped, subtitled, looped, dissected. Yet the more it was shown, the more the silence behind it became deafening. What wasn't captured by the camera was the way the officer's hand pressed just a little too tight on her arm, the look of disbelief in her eyes as a crowd gathered, but said nothing, and the way the air itself seemed to freeze when she stated, calmly but firmly, "I am a sitting judge." The city's communications office released a bland statement by noon, an ongoing internal review, a promise of transparency, and the usual assurance of procedural fairness. But those words had grown thin with overuse, and the community this time wasn't interested in waiting quietly for clarification. By late evening, an investigative team from Channel 4 had launched a special segment titled, "Misjudged When the Gavel Isn't Enough." They replayed the footage with careful narration, pairing it with archival images of Miriam from her swearing-in ceremony, her appearances at high school graduations, and her community legal workshops. It was a stark contrast, dignity in black robes, side by side with humiliation in steel cuffs. The effect was chilling. Miriam, meanwhile, remained largely silent, at least in public. But behind the scenes, she was deliberate, strategic. She gathered her own records, surveillance footage from nearby storefronts, voice recordings from bystanders, and legal documentation, verifying her vehicle ownership, all time-stamped and notarized. She wasn't just building a case, she was building a record, one that could withstand not only scrutiny but also dismissal. Her closest colleague, Judge Alton Reed, visited her that Thursday evening. He didn't knock like a guest. He walked in like kin. She was at the dining table, papers spread out in careful columns, a single lamp illuminating the wood beneath them. "You planning to take this all the way?" he asked gently. Miriam didn't look up immediately. She circled something in red pen. "It's not about me anymore," she said, her voice low. "If I let this go, I teach every young black girl watching that silence is survival." Alton sat beside her, his hands folding slowly. "Then I'll be at your side when you speak. And I'll be behind you when they try to shut the door." The next day, Miriam filed a formal complaint, not just with the local precinct, but with the State Judicial Ethics Committee and the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. It was not an emotional document, it was surgical, factual, chronological, but woven through it was an unflinching indictment of the culture that had allowed this moment to happen, a culture that had learned how to police the presence of black bodies, but not how to recognize the authority of black minds. Social media erupted. Hashtags surged. But it wasn't just digital noise. A retired federal judge wrote an op-ed titled, "When Justice is Mistaken for Theft." Civil rights attorneys from 4 counties volunteered to support her. Even the mayor, who'd known Miriam for over 2 decades, was forced to respond, offering a public apology, a call for calm, and an invitation for private dialogue. But Miriam declined the closed-door meeting. "This isn't about comfort," she said to the press, standing on the same steps where she had once been honored for community service. "This is about accountability, and accountability happens in public." The officer involved, identified as Patrolman David Lenner, was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours. His personnel file, released under pressure from a public records request, revealed previous complaints, none resulting in discipline. And so, the story widened. It stopped being just about one arrest. It became about patterns, blind spots, systemic erosion, masked as protocol. CNN ran a feature called "Black Robes, White Knuckles, Race Authority, and American Law Enforcement." They interviewed judges across the country, some anonymous, some bold enough to go on record, each sharing their own experiences of being mistaken, disrespected, or outright endangered in moments where their credentials should have been more than enough. Miriam watched these stories unfold, each one echoing pieces of her own. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, she wrote. She journaled every night in quiet script, recording not only what happened, but how it felt, how her breath caught in her chest the moment the cuffs clicked, how no one made eye contact, how even after being released, she was not offered an apology, only a receipt. That weekend, NPR aired a segment featuring her former law professor, now retired, who recalled Miriam's first week in class. "She didn't speak often," he said, "but when she did, the room listened. I'm glad the country's listening now." The pressure continued to mount. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, not with signs of fury but with signs of dignity. "I could be her," read one. "My judge," my voice, read another. They stood silently for hours. Grandmothers, teenagers, clergy in white collars, Vietnam veterans, teachers, judges in plain clothes. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a vigil. As the week closed, Miriam sat once more in her office alone, the late light casting soft gold against her framed certificates and well-worn law books. She stared at her computer screen, an open draft of her upcoming editorial glowing quietly. But before she returned to typing, she closed her eyes and replayed the moment one more time, not to feel pain, but to remember the power of naming it. Because when injustice hides behind uniformity, silence is complicity. And Miriam Ellison that week had chosen not just to speak but to make sure the country would not look away. The morning of the hearing arrived with a gray sky stretched over the town like a veil. The courthouse stood quiet at first, its stone facade still damp from the early rain, but by 8:00 a.m., A crowd had begun to gather: neighbors, pastors, veterans, former students, and quiet observers who rarely made their way to the county steps unless it mattered. Today it mattered. Not because someone had been accused of a violent crime, but because the justice system itself had to face the mirror. Inside, the air was cooler than usual, the lights humming faintly overhead. The courtroom filled slowly but steadily, pew by pew, like a sanctuary before a sermon. The media had been allowed in under strict decorum: no flash, no noise, just observation. At the plaintiff's table sat Judge Miriam Ellison, not in robes but in a deep navy suit, her shoulders squared and her hands folded calmly on the polished wood. Her presence did not demand attention, it commanded respect. She sat beside her attorney, Sheila Morales, a soft-spoken but ferociously intelligent civil rights litigator, known more for her preparation than her performance. Across the aisle, the city's legal counsel prepared its files and notes, all expressionless, all polished. There was no criminal trial today, no defendant, but make no mistake, this was a trial of conscience, of integrity, of who got to define justice in a country that still hadn't made peace with its contradictions. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs with clarity: "All rise." And just like that, everyone did. Judge Morton Holloway entered from the side door, his black robe falling gently with each step. A white man in his late 60s, he had served this district for over 3 decades. Some questioned whether he was too close to retire, too old to change. But today, as he looked across the room and met Miriam's eyes, there was a stillness in his gaze that suggested he understood the gravity of what sat before him. "You may be seated." The bench creaked as bodies lowered in near unison, and then the silence took over, the kind that doesn't invite noise, only truth. Sheila stood first. "Your Honor, today's motion is not about pride, it's about precedent. It's about whether a judge, black or white, has the right to dignity in her own city." Her voice didn't tremble, it didn't rise. It held steady like a tide coming in, calm but unrelenting. She detailed the events: the mistaken stop, the unjust handcuffing, the dismissal of identity, the silence that followed. And then she read from the city's own training manual, line by line, describing how officers were taught to verify identity before proceeding with force. "The question, Your Honor," Sheila concluded, "is not whether the officer was afraid, it's whether his fear outweighed his responsibility to the truth." The city's lawyer, Martin Landry, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice used to conferences more than courtrooms, replied with formality, "We do not dispute the facts. We only ask the court to consider whether this was a singular mistake or evidence of a systemic pattern." Miriam listened without flinching. But in her chest, a quiet memory stirred. Her late father himself, once accused of stealing his own radio while walking home from his shift at the factory. He never got an apology, just a bruise and a warning. That story had shaped her path, and now it shaped her resolve. A witness was called, a bystander who had recorded the arrest. He was soft-spoken, unsure at first, but grew more certain with each answer. "I knew who she was," he said. "I recognized her. But when I tried to tell the officer, he told me to step back." Judge Holloway nodded slightly but said nothing. Another witness, Officer Leonard's direct supervisor, testified next. He admitted the body cam footage was incomplete. "It shut off mid-incident," he explained. "We don't know why." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Miriam's attorney didn't react. She had expected this. Sheila placed a still frame on the overhead projector, a screenshot taken from a nearby security camera showing the moment the officer reached for the cuffs, despite Miriam holding her judicial ID in plain sight. "That is not fear," Sheila said quietly. "That is refusal." By midday, the room felt heavier. People leaned forward, elbows on knees. Some scribbled notes. Others simply watched. The weight of history pressed against the walls of past hearings, where truth was bent, where voices like Miriam's were silenced, where the law was wielded like a blade instead of a shield. Then at 2:00 p.m. Judge Holloway asked the most unexpected question. "Judge Ellison," he said, "would you be willing to address the court?" There was no requirement for her to do so, no obligation, but Miriam rose anyway, not with a dramatic pause, just a breath. She walked slowly to the witness stand, not to defend herself, but to speak. "I do not stand here out of anger," she began, "but out of obligation. Not just to myself, but to the robe I wear and the people who trust its power." She paused. The room listened. "I was humiliated in public, not because I broke the law, but because I was not seen as the law. That is the reality of what happened. And if I, with all my credentials, my tenure, and my title can be erased with the snap of handcuffs, then what does that mean for those without such armor? The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of recognition, of reckoning, of something old finally being named. When she returned to her seat, the tension didn't release, but something settled. The hearing concluded without a ruling that day. Judge Holloway said he would deliberate privately and issue a written decision within the week. But the outcome felt secondary to what had transpired. Something had shifted not just in the courtroom but in the hearts of those who filled its benches. As the crowd filtered slowly out into the late afternoon sun, conversations began, not with complaints but with commitments, to teach, to vote, to attend, to stay engaged, not just when the cameras were on but especially when they weren't. And as Miriam stepped out last her heels, clicking gently on the marble floor, she looked up at the old courthouse clock, its hands steady, unwavering, honest. For the first time in days, she exhaled, not because it was over, but because truth had finally been spoken under oath in full view without apology. And that she knew was how change began. 3 days after the courtroom hearing, Judge Miriam Ellison sat alone on the back porch of her modest home, her fingers wrapped gently around a ceramic mug of lukewarm tea. The morning air still held the chill of early fall, and from her seat, she could see the last leaves of a red maple trembling in the soft wind. Her neighborhood quiet, tree-lined ordinary had always been her sanctuary, a place where her title never mattered, where she was simply Miss Miriam to the kids riding their bikes past her fence. But now even here something had shifted. The eyes that passed her on morning walks lingered just a moment longer. The tone of greetings carried something unspoken, respect maybe, or discomfort, or something heavier they didn't know how to name. Her phone buzzed again, another call from a reporter. She didn't answer. They had started with the local papers, but by now, the requests came from national networks, political podcasts, and morning shows. Everyone wanted a soundbite, a quote, a reaction. But Miriam wasn't interested in being a viral headline. What she wanted was something deeper, accountability that could not be clipped into a reel or spun into someone else's narrative. "Do you want to give a statement at the vigil tonight?" Sheila had asked her the night before, her voice steady but her eyes searching. "People will be expecting it." Miriam had paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wasn't sure anyone was ready to listen for the right reasons. Still, she nodded. "Yes. But I'll speak last." At 6 p.m., they gathered hundreds of people, some carrying candles, others holding hand-painted signs with phrases like, "Justice for Miriam," or "See us clearly." The steps of the courthouse, once the scene of her humiliation, now served as the platform for a different kind of reckoning. The air pulsed with quiet intensity, the kind born not from rage but from resolve. Reverend Carter opened the evening with a prayer not just of healing but of courage. "Let us remember," he said, "that change does not come because we're loud. It comes because we're clear." His voice echoed through the open square, mixing with the low hum of traffic and the rustle of jackets, as people shifted their weight in the cooling dusk. One by one, speakers stepped forward. A high school senior named Jamila recited a poem about justice written in response to the arrest. A retired police captain shared his discomfort with the silence from within his own department. Even Councilwoman Teresa Grant, who had previously remained quiet, finally stepped up and called for a formal review board. Then it was Miriam's turn. She didn't stand on the top step. She chose the third one from the ground, close enough to be seen, close enough to still feel part of the people. Her voice, when it came, didn't shake. It didn't rise above the wind, but it carried. "I was raised to believe that the law was sacred," she began. "And for most of my life, I have tried to live up to its highest promise. But what happened to me was not a lapse in judgment. It was a reflection of something far deeper, of who we assume is worthy of respect and who we expect to justify their existence." There were no cheers, no chants, just silence. That sacred kind of silence that means everyone is listening. "I do not want pity," she continued. "What I want is partnership. What I want is for you to stay just as awake as you are now, even when the cameras leave." She stepped down quietly, the crowd parting slightly to let her return to her seat. Someone began to sing softly an old hymn from the civil rights era, and then another joined in and another until the voices blended into something that felt like memory and movement at once. That night, back home, Miriam received a call not from a journalist but from Judge Holloway. "I reviewed everything he said without preamble, and I've drafted a letter to the state bar. Not just about this officer, but about the training failures, the policy gaps, and the cultural assumptions we've tolerated far too long. There was a pause. Then he added more quietly, "You shouldn't have had to carry this burden alone." Miriam didn't say thank you. Instead, she replied, "It's not about what should have happened, it's about what happens now." The next morning, news spread that a coalition of community leaders was forming a citizen oversight board, one with real teeth, real subpoena power, and real community input. The mayor, under public pressure, pledged to support it. 3 other judges in neighboring districts wrote public essays, adding their own stories of being challenged, questioned, or dismissed, based on appearance rather than position. A local university invited Miriam to co-develop a new module for its police academy on judicial interaction and implicit bias. But the most unexpected moment came later that week when a group of young law students, mostly black, mostly women, visited her chambers. They didn't ask for advice. They just wanted to sit with her to listen. One of them, her voice barely louder than a whisper, said, "You gave me permission to stay in this profession. Thank you." Miriam looked at her, then at the others, then out the window to the courtyard where the ginkgo trees were starting to turn yellow. And in that moment something inside her, something heavy, unclenched. Because she realized this was never just about what had been taken from her that day by one officer. It was about what she now had the chance to give back on her terms. 6 weeks later, the city council chamber filled once again, but this time the faces inside were not drawn in outrage or doubt. They were listening with quiet attention, heads, slightly tilted brows furrowed in thoughtful resolve. Outside, a small crowd had gathered along the sidewalk, bundled in scarves and jackets, watching the live stream from a mounted screen. The seal of the city hung behind the dais, the gold leaf gleaming under soft lighting as Judge Miriam Ellison sat in the second row, neither witness nor plaintiff this time, just a citizen who had seen the system from every angle. A motion was on the table, simple in wording but profound in implication. The council was voting to establish a permanent civilian oversight committee, independent of the police department, staffed by both legal professionals and residents. Its purpose to review all misconduct cases involving public officials, regardless of rank, and report findings publicly. No secrecy, no shielding, just sunlight. Councilman Baker leaned forward and spoke in a measured tone. "This isn't about one officer. This is about restoring something we've been losing: public trust. And to do that, we need transparency with teeth." Miriam watched as hands raised one by one, then all at once. The motion passed unanimously. She exhaled, not loudly, not with celebration, but with something steadier. A quiet acceptance that sometimes justice does arrive, not always on time, not always cleanly, but it comes when enough people decide they won't let the moment slip by. Afterward, people filtered into the hallway, hugging, shaking hands, even crying softly. Someone touched Miriam's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not backing down." She nodded, eyes moist but voice firm. "We're just getting started." That weekend, a formal apology was issued by the department. It was read publicly on the courthouse steps by the police chief himself, who stood beside her with both remorse and accountability in his expression. "Judge Ellison," he said, "we failed you, not just in action but in principle, and we commit today not only to repairing trust but to earning it every day moving forward." The statement, carefully worded and fully transparent, was later published in every local newspaper and on the department's website. Later that day, Miriam visited her father's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the wind rustling through tall oaks and brittle grass. She stood in front of the modest headstone, one hand resting on the cold granite, and let the silence settle between them. "I did what you asked, Daddy," she whispered. "I stood up when it mattered. I told the truth, even when it hurt." The sky above was pale blue, streaked with soft gray, and the breeze carried the faint smell of pine needles and damp earth. She didn't cry. Not this time. She simply closed her eyes, let the wind lift the edges of her coat, and stood in the fullness of the moment. Back in her chambers the following Monday, things had mostly returned to routine. A stack of case files waited on her desk, and the familiar rhythm of clerks passing through the hallways resumed like a song with no need for rehearsal. But something was different. The air felt clearer. The voices felt more intentional. And when Miriam entered the courtroom that morning in her robe, the silence that greeted her held a deeper kind of respect. During the recess, a young bailiff approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, eyes earnest, "I just wanted to say, it changed how I think about this job, about who we protect." She smiled softly. "Good," she said. "Now let it change how you act." That night she sat on her porch again, this time not alone. Her niece Camille had come down from D.C. for a visit, and the two women sat in folding chairs, sipping tea, watching the porch light cast long shadows across the steps. "Do you ever regret it?" Camille asked, bringing it all to light. Miriam took a long breath. "Number I regret. Not saying something sooner. For all the times I let things slide, thinking it wasn't worth the fight." Camille was quiet, watching her aunt, then asked, "Do you think it'll stay changed?" Miriam didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the streetlight at the corner where moths spun in small glowing circles. "It'll stay changed," she finally said, "if people like you keep showing up." The porch creaked as the wind moved through it again, and for a while they just sat in that quiet together, two generations bound, not just by blood but by shared purpose. And that night, when Miriam went inside and turned off the light, she paused at the threshold of her living room. The old photograph of her parents sat where it always had, beside a folded American flag and a copy of the Constitution worn from use. She looked at it then, at her reflection in the dark window, and allowed herself a rare moment of peace. Not triumph, not closure, just peace. The kind that comes not when everything is perfect, but when you've done the hard thing, told the hard truth, and still found your way home. The disciplinary hearing was not held in a courtroom but in a high-ceilinged municipal conference room, lined with rows of folding chairs and a modest seal of the department affixed above the panel. The windows were shuttered, but you could hear the wind pressing against the glass like a reminder that even the outside world was waiting to see what would happen inside. Judge Miriam Ellison arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness but out of respect for the process, for the truth, and for the people who had shown up, because they believed that something had to change and that it had to start here. The officer who had arrested her, Deputy Aaron Calloway, was already seated at the table with his union attorney beside him. He didn't look at her when she walked in. He kept his head low, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the edge of his notepad like he was somewhere else entirely. Across the aisle sat members of the Internal Affairs Board, City Legal Counsel, and representatives from the Community Review Committee. There was no jury here, no bailiff announcing order, just silence paper and the weight of reputation. Miriam took her seat, placed her notes on the table, and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't glance around the room, didn't search for faces she might recognize. Her focus was straight ahead, her breathing steady, her voice tucked inside her chest like something waiting its turn. When the hearing began, it was the committee chair who spoke first. His voice was calm, measured, and firm. "This proceeding concerns Officer Calloway's conduct on the 18th of October during an unlawful detainment of Judge Miriam Ellison," he said. "Our objective is to assess not only the individual's actions but the systems that enabled them." Miriam was called to speak second. She stood slowly, her back straight, her expression composed. She wasn't there to humiliate. She wasn't there to seek revenge. She was there because silence was a form of complicity, and she had promised herself and her father's memory that she wouldn't be complicit again. She spoke plainly. "The issue is not that I was arrested," she said. "The issue is that I was presumed guilty not by what I did but by how I looked." She recounted each step of that day, not to dramatize but to make it undeniable. The questions that weren't asked, the assumptions that were made, the escalation without provocation, the cuffs, the moment he heard her title and didn't believe her. And then she paused. "I am one of the fortunate ones," she said. "I have a title that protected me eventually. But what about those who don't? What about the ones who never get to prove who they are?" There was a stillness in the room when she finished. No applause. Just gravity. Officer Calloway was asked to respond. His voice was quieter than anyone expected. "I made a mistake," he said. "A serious one. I didn't follow protocol, and I didn't look past my bias. That's on me." But as he continued, it became clear his words were shaped more by legal coaching than moral reckoning. "I believed at the time I was acting in good faith," he added, and somewhere behind him a woman in the audience softly scoffed. When the committee recessed to deliberate, Miriam stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow, and the air smelled faintly of paper and floor wax. She leaned against the wall, loosening her shoulders. Her friend Sheila approached quietly. "You did what needed to be done," Sheila said. Miriam nodded but didn't speak. An hour later they were called back in. The committee issued its finding in a monotone, but the words landed with weight. Officer Calloway was found in violation of multiple department standards, including excessive detainment without probable cause and failure to identify status after lawful disclosure. The recommendation: immediate suspension without pay, mandatory racial bias, retraining, and removal from field duty pending further review. It wasn't jail time, it wasn't termination, but it was accountability. It was the beginning of a paper trail that couldn't be buried, and perhaps more importantly, it was the first time in that city's history that a civilian oversight committee had influenced an officer's career trajectory. After the hearing, a reporter caught up with Miriam outside. He was young, polite, and hesitant. "Do you think justice was served?" he asked, holding his mic at chest level. She looked him straight in the eye. "Justice isn't a moment," she said. "It's a direction. And today, we moved slightly closer." Then she turned and walked down the stone steps, her heels echoing softly with each step, the evening sun casting her shadow long across the pavement. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Inside the hearing room slowly emptied. Officer Calloway remained behind, seated alone at the table. He stared ahead, but this time his hands were still. And outside, as Miriam disappeared into the city's quiet rhythm, a single thought stayed with her, not bitter, not triumphant, just clear. Accountability isn't about punishment, it's about honesty. It's about learning to stand in the mirror and not flinch at what looks back. And as the courthouse faded behind her and the streetlight flickered on overhead, she knew this chapter was closing, not because the damage had been erased, but because the truth had finally been named. 3 months had passed since the hearing, and spring had begun to bloom in the city of Shiloh, Tennessee. Dogwoods lined the courthouse lawn, their pale blossoms trembling gently in the breeze, and church bells rang faintly in the distance, as if calling the town into a new season, not just of weather but of purpose. Judge Miriam Ellison stood in the community center auditorium, facing a group of high school seniors and their parents, each seat filled with young eyes eager and older ones watchful. Today's topic wasn't law or politics. It was responsibility. The kind that starts in the small corners of a neighborhood and ripples outward like a stone tossed into still water. She took a sip from a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, then cleared her throat and stepped forward without notes. "There's a difference," she began, her voice firm but kind, "between having power and choosing to use it well. That difference can change lives." The students leaned in not because they had to, but because something about her cadence made them want to. She told them the story. Not every detail, not every headline, just the truth of what it felt like to be handcuffed, not for what you'd done, but for who someone assumed you were. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't cold. It was listening. She paused, letting the stillness sit. Then she said softly, "You can't always control what happens to you, but you can decide how you answer it. That's what citizenship means. That's what legacy is." Later, a student named Kareem raised his hand, his voice unsure at first. "How did you know they'd listen, that anything would come from it?" She smiled gently. "I didn't," she said. "But I knew. If I didn't speak, nothing ever would." That night she sat on her porch as dusk painted the sky lavender and blue. The cicadas had returned early this year, their song vibrating through the branches like the hum of an old gospel tune. Across the street, porch lights flicked on one by one, and children's laughter echoed faintly down the block. Shiloh was still small, still southern, still scarred in places, but now something in the air felt slightly more awake, slightly more honest. A letter rested in her lap, written in careful cursive by a woman she had never met, an elderly black librarian from Jackson. It read in part, "You stood for us, for those of us who couldn't, and we saw you. We heard you. We're standing now too." Miriam folded the letter and held it in both hands like a sacred artifact. She thought of her father again, his sermons, his quiet fire, the way he had marched with King, not for glory but for change that outlasted noise. He used to say, "Make your life a door, baby girl, not a wall," and she understood now what he meant. The next morning she joined a city council working group, drafting new procedures for community policing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was necessary. Language had to be precise, roles had to be clear, oversight had to be real. And Miriam insisted gently but relentlessly that the process include voices from neighborhoods that had gone too long unseen. Across town, a mural had begun to take shape on the side of a public library. It wasn't of her face; she had specifically asked them not to paint her. Instead, it showed a woman's hands, one held out, palm up the other, breaking a pair of handcuffs in two. Around the image were phrases submitted by local children: "Be fair, ask first, respect is free, truth doesn't fear the light." When Miriam visited the mural weeks later, she didn't announce herself. She stood quietly, her coat buttoned tight against the wind, and watched as two teenage girls pointed at the wall, then at each other, smiling, as if they understood that this was also about them. She turned to leave, but was stopped by an older man with gray in his beard and calluses on his palms. "You did good," he said simply. "Real good." She nodded. "Thank you." He looked up at the mural again. "You gave this town something it forgot it had its own backbone." And as she walked away, his words echoed behind her, not as flattery, but as confirmation. Change, she realized, doesn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. It arrives when people stop whispering and start building one uncomfortable truth, one hard conversation, one act of courage at a time. She stepped into the courthouse that afternoon with a different energy in her stride. Not defiance, not weariness, just clarity. The past couldn't be rewritten and justice couldn't be undone for what had already passed. But from here on out, the terms had changed. Not because the law had suddenly found its soul, but because the people who held it accountable refused to look away anymore. Miriam sat in her chambers as the clock ticked quietly, sunlight dancing on the edges of her bookshelf. She reached for a pen and began drafting a new mentorship program, one where high school students could shadow court officials, attend hearings, and learn not just how the law worked, but how it ought to serve. Because in the end, stories like hers weren't meant to be exceptions. They were meant to be fuel. And so she wrote, and the city listened. And for the first time in a long time, the promise of justice felt not like a slogan, but like something ordinary people could shape, protect, and pass on. Sometimes justice doesn't come with headlines. It comes in quiet choices, in the courage to stand up when it would be easier to walk away. Judge Miriam Ellison's story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by titles or uniforms. It lives in how we treat one another, especially when no one's watching. Her resilience teaches us that speaking up even when your voice shakes can spark change that echoes far beyond a single moment. For those of us who've lived through decades of struggle and hard-earned progress, we know true justice takes time. It takes people who remember the lessons of the past and are willing to guide the next generation forward with wisdom, patience, and grit. Whether you're leading a room or sitting on your front porch, your voice still matters. Your presence still matters. And maybe the most powerful lesson is this: we don't need to be perfect to stand for what's right, we just need to be present. Every time we choose compassion over judgment, truth over silence, and action over fear, we leave something better behind. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't fade with time. It grows stronger with every life it touches. If this story moved you, we invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of doing what's right.